Welcome back to the Authority X Factor podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Schuknecht. And in my book, Unlocking Your Authority X Factor, which I now have a copy of to show, I talk about the chaos season, that period where your business is growing, but your systems are held together with duct tape and good intentions. Today's guest has built her entire Authority X Factor around being the person who ends that chaos. Leah Leaves is the founder of Alderaan, where she embeds seasoned directors of operations and project managers directly into remote marketing and advertising agencies. Leah isn't just giving tips and templates, she's providing embedded leadership for founders who are ready to step out of the weeds and stop losing good clients to bad systems. With more years in the agency world than she cares to count, Leah has seen the same patterns of silos and dropped handoffs over and over again. Instead of just offering advice, she's built a reputation for taking ownership and restoring a founder's confidence in their own business. Today, we're going to talk about how Leah moved from being the person doing the work to the visible leader fixing the industry's biggest operational headaches. We'll dive into how she built a brand around ending the chaos and uncover the unique Authority X Factor that makes her a fractional partner that agency owners actually trust. Leah, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to talk about the X Factor and the agency operations world.
Yeah. So I want to start with your Authority X Factor. So I describe that as the intersection of kind of your unique skill set and experiences and what led you to lead your clients in the way that you do now. We all have, these years of experience that leads us, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in the direction of where we land, right? And you landed with starting your company to help your clients in a very specific way. So tell me how you would define your Authority X Factor.
Yeah, I appreciate the question to think about and really dive deep, into it because you're right that, I've been in the agency space and the operations niche within the agency space for a long time. And it actually was quite an organic evolution. It's quite a natural progression of events that, going way back, I actually started in technical journalism and went online or remote at the very beginning of my career and adapted it into content marketing and then started working with agencies. And I bring that up because I think it informs, that X factor for me because back in the day with more of the technical or traditional journalism that you're taught often, to think in big picture to little picture, right? So you're thinking of like, what is the big picture here? What is the goal? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to communicate? And then you start breaking it down into the details. And that informed, how I approach, agency operations for years now, where every time I come into an agency or my team comes into an agency, we always start with, okay, what's the vision? Where are we headed? What's the North Star? Okay, then you go into what systems, are existing at the moment or lack thereof, and then you get into the details of like who is responsible, what does it actually look like in practice? Yeah, and so it's been this journey, of taking all of these experiences, from thinking kind of big to little, where you're seeing the 30,000-foot view, the 10,000-foot view, and then like the boots on the ground view. For agency operations, you need that. You need the 360 degrees to be able to pull the threads together, connect the dots, and ultimately achieve those goals for the agency owner, like getting out of the weeds and making operations smoother, ensuring that the team is happy and actually enjoys, what they're doing. And you have great client retention. And that again, like everyone is kind of rowing in the same direction. So I think over the years, I've refined that approach. I've labeled that approach. We call it the Alderaan approach. And we go through systematically, but also adapt it to each agency. Because of course, every agency is a snowflake. And so we want to come in and make sure we're respectful of their special ingredients, and how they approach marketing and advertising online. And so we adapt it, but we also have that infrastructure to lean on. And so I think that's where my X factor has come through, is taking all these, really disparate points of information and then being able to pull it through a very simple framework, and an infrastructure to actually derive results, and outcomes, that agencies are looking for.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things that that you talked about there, I want to dig into a little bit more. So one is there's a couple things there. So you work as in operations on the operations side of things. So that's kind of one area. And then also specifically with agencies. So I want to talk about kind of how that came about. Tell me about when did you start Alderaan?
So I actually started it back in 2012, and I started it as an independent contractor on my own. I learned very early on in my career that I loved working with multiple companies at the same time, for the variety, for the excitement. I am also a bit of a quick start, and I like to jump into things, and I get my hands dirty. And so being able to have that variety to work with, from different companies and some of them were just like online small businesses, and then when I really started leaning into more of like content marketing and started working as an independent contractor with agencies, that's when I think the light bulb really turned on. Because with small businesses, it felt, I'll be honest, sometimes a little transactional, that they were just looking for an individual to kind of come in and get certain tasks done, but there wasn't a seat at the table to talk through strategy and process and systems. And at agencies, especially smaller agencies, I found that they were very open to creative ideas. My ideas just happened to be creative processes, and more systems oriented rather than just, marketing strategy. And there were often times the agencies that I was working with early on that had zero of those conversations going on because they were all letting everybody do what they did best on the strategic side, on the marketing side, on the advertising and content side, but they didn't really have anyone talking about kind of like the infrastructure, the back end operations, like how did all of this work actually move from one person to the next? How were clients onboarded? How were team members paid? Kind of the common sense of business, 101, but that most agencies that they just don't think about because as we call them, like they're more often than not coming from the accidental agency owner.
Mhm.
They're just so good at what they do, for marketing and advertising that they attracted so much more business that they needed to start hiring for contractors or team. And next thing they know, they wake up and they have a business. So for my kind of natural skill set, it just flourished in agencies where I could start building that infrastructure for them from the inside out. And then it kept evolving from doing that, at a project management level, account management level, then a true more like operations director level. And then I became a full-time COO with an agency and had that amazing opportunity, to lead an organization for several years. But unfortunately, I did what I think a lot of people in the agency industry do. I burned myself out because I was taking on way too much. And so I exited from that full-time role and came back into the fractional space and really kicked the tires on the organization on Alderaan, trying to find that sweet spot of, how can I connect those dots for more agencies? And so I was the fractional COO for a while. Again, took on too many roles and said, okay, starting to recognize these visionary tendencies here a little bit, need to reassess. And that's when a number of years ago, we started offering other fractionals. So we have other fractional COOs, directors of ops, we have ops managers, project managers of all levels, because we found that there are a lot of agencies out there that are fundamentally lacking in that infrastructure, in those systems, kind of that back office support, just connecting the dots and making sure that, again, everyone's kind of pointed in the same direction together. So it's been a number of years, that I've been, within agencies. And then again, it kind of organically evolved into the operations space because I found that that was the silent killer for most agencies, honestly,
Yeah.
is the lack, of true operations.
So going back to before Alderaan and when you started that in 2012, I think you said, what had you done before that?
Yeah. So as an independent contractor before that, without it being branded, at that point, as Alderaan and it was just more of an individual, I had been working with other small online businesses. Like I mentioned before, I've been remote pretty much my entire career, and so I adapted, my skill set, in content marketing, in from journalism, but then also my natural tendencies toward operations to kind of jump into a little bit of everything. for these smaller businesses. So I worked for some online businesses where I ended up doing, for example, like data control,
Yeah.
and did, some QA, QC, I built, an online magazine in the outdoor industry space, and was very connected, with that community for a long time. So there were a lot of different components, of what it actually looked like in practice, but they all kind of threaded back to something around organization and
Mhm.
operations and connecting, some of those dots.
Yeah. So you didn't have a job as like an operations manager or operations director or like something like that, like a job doing that. You kind of like learned your skill set and then started a company and kind of like sounds to me like you almost kind of learned as you were going. It was like you were doing different things and then kind of like got more and more specific to what your authority X factor was and what you were best suited, how you were best suited to help people.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very natural because there were some, I'd say, quote unquote, formal, jobs that I had. So, for example, during university, as an office manager, and doing that part time while I was full time, in school at the same time. And so I had some of those opportunities to learn from kind of a more formal. Perspective, but more often than not, because I was remote, I was exposed to the freelance world very early on. And so I was able to float with that and find different jobs that I was more attracted to rather than I think sometimes people felt like they had to do. So it was a lot of great interactions and networking, and referral based, roles that I had. And it just kept growing, from there. So it was very early on. I was a remote, or a digital chief of staff, for a digital business, and so this was also before I think a lot of these titles had, especially because I was working with more small agencies or small companies, they had fewer of the responsibilities defined. It was just kind of I need that right hand person to plug in and help me with the day to day. And because I think in a lot of ways, I'll be honest, I was young and, I could just say, "Oh, yes, I would love to jump in, and do a little bit of everything, because I was curious and I was hungry, to learn. And I'll be also honest that I was probably a little hungry for control, so I could get in, at a very early stage for some of these small companies and see their entire organization, at a very early stage, in my career no matter if they had been around for a number of years or not. And so then I took a lot of those organic experiences and over the years started honing them into where are my strengths and where are my areas that I could potentially be better about delegating or coaching others at rather than being the executor for absolutely everything.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember those early days in my career. Like, I think not to generalize, but I do think women tend to be a little more organizational minded, right? And so we find ourselves in roles or get these opportunities for maybe some operations type work. And I remember that like getting kind of put into these like roles that were kind of operations based but it wasn't my skill set. Like, I mean, I could do it, but it wasn't something I felt like I would not say that I was great at that. I think, I ended up starting a marketing agency because I think there's a creative piece that I needed that more creative piece of what I was doing. Not that your work isn't creative, it's just in a different way. But anyways, so yeah, so I totally identified with that when you were talking about that. Like some of the opportunities that come to you made sense at the time, and then you saw kind of what you were good at and what you enjoyed. And I don't think I heard how the shift into like agencies specifically happened. Tell me about that. So you were already running Alderaan, like working, taking some of those, and I want to talk a little bit more about that too, where you talked about kind of they hire operations like kind of task rabbits, like they need stuff done, but like not like the overall strategy of operations. But at what point was that you got really specific to working with agencies and kind of how did that come about?
Yeah, so it was during probably the period of like 2010 to 2015, is when still had clients that were generalized like small service businesses. Occasionally I'd have like a product based business that I was working with online as well. But during that time, I had also started freelancing with a couple of agencies. Yeah. And so I think it was around again, kind of that middle period, where it wasn't a very conscious choice of I just picked that industry and then ran into it. It was, oh, again, I was connected, to an agency, had a freelance gig with them, and then started doing more and more work with them. And it just kept growing from there because then over several years, and again, probably 2014, 2015, when the majority of my clients, it all shifted into, it was all agencies or majority agencies at that point. And so again, it kind of organically happened, where they had the most creative chaos, that I could wrangle and they had the most need for it and were very open to having somebody take a little bit of everything, off of their plates, and I was very keen, to do that because I was curious about all of the different functions, within an agency. I was curious about both organic and paid, about the creative, and the development. And so I really wanted to understand the operating procedures of all of those different functions. And so I would kind of insert myself into them and then over time again had more of those titles like project manager. So even though I started, with like web development, I did content, production and content development. I was in ad managers, and campaign platforms, so I was executing a lot of the work and understanding from the ground up what these people did really, on a day-to-day basis, rather than just from the top-down approach, that some of the agency owners were coming at. Then over time, I could start building the systems and connecting the dots for them to make it more streamlined. So it kept again kind of evolving over time, but I'd say probably again, early on. So it's been a little over a decade that it's been more exclusively agencies, and I think the reason why I've stuck with it for so long now as well is because there is still this innate need for good operations in agencies that I really feel strongly that agencies bring a ton of value to the economy, to their communities, to their individual team members, and giving them the opportunity to amplify their creative passions. So I fully believe in the agency industry, as a whole. And I think over time, I've wanted to help get it to this golden age, where it has had a balance, maybe a little bit more of a balance of that creative, and that operations side. Because to me, operations is it's not about red tape. It's not about, taking all this creative energy and then shoving it into a box and just having it be like a checklist. Like, trust me, I love a good checklist, and they have their place, but it's always there. It's similar to like how I view AI in agencies right now. It's there to help increase the value and amplification, of that marketing prowess, that agencies bring. It's not meant to dampen it or constrain it. So I think over the years, I've started to learn how to articulate that better, that operations really is the kernel of great agencies to amplify and do what they do best even better. Because I think in the past, I likened it to how you mentioned, you opened a marketing agency because it's more on the creative side. I think I started learning and reflecting early on that one of the reasons I was really attracted to journalism actually was for the editing side of it rather than the writing side of it, because there were a lot of incredible writers that were pouring their heart and soul onto paper, again, whether it was traditional or creative, writing, but they really needed some support in the architecture of it and in the editing and the refinement. And so I always was attracted to being more of an editor than a writer. And so in the agency space, still very attracted to those creatives, to those visionaries, those writers, essentially, and those marketers, but still being their editor, being the person that can help them take that great idea, but make it just that little bit better. So that's kind of how it's evolved, with agencies specifically.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about the editing piece. Probably a lot of what you do is editing in a very different way, but it's editing within the operations, right? Like making these small adjustments that are necessary and maybe not as recognizable to everyone, but when you make the adjustments, it makes the organization more perfect in the end. So
Yes, it's kind of like in, even like in theater, where it's like if everything is going smoothly behind the scenes, you'll never see it, but everything on the front of the house will go flawlessly, and very similar in agencies.
yeah, you definitely described that better than I did. But yes, that's where that's what I was going for.
Mhm.
So, you talked about the organizations that would hire you to do the tasks, like like you. I totally understand that as a small business, there's just all these like little things that need to be done, right? And so they were looking to you like, hey, can you just take this off my plate, right? But how do you help organizations like that see the bigger picture, like see kind of that it isn't just about the tasks, but that it's a more comprehensive kind of approach to their operations.
Yeah, I take a very consultative approach, to whether it's an agency or another, small business, again, service or product based, where I want to understand first and foremost, their big picture, their vision. Because the more that you can get them talking about what it means to them and how it impacts them as an individual, then it can essentially shine the light on the path forward, at least in how I take all that information and then distill it and synthesize it into like a plan. Is I always want to start out with, again, like where are they headed? Where do they want to be? Where have they been that they really are frustrated by? And getting them talking about that, because yes, I can come in, or any of my team can come in, and again, check the boxes, push the buttons, move things around, be the task rabbit. You will then just get stuff done, on a day-to-day basis, that just keeps the company, at the level that it's at. You will never reach velocity or momentum, or growth. It's pretty stagnant. And I will say that some companies, especially those that I worked with very, very early on, wanted to just get to that. They said, like, I'm not looking to double in size. I don't have these, big dreams of, having a team of 200 people. Like, no, no, no. I just want things to be easier from day to day to day. And that's okay. Like that is what is important to them. And so then the expectation is set. Great. It is a task rabbit role, and you just need essentially some adjustments at the beginning, some refinement, and then maintenance. And personally, for me, I found that I could be really good at building, all the infrastructure, setting everything up, make it really easy to run the business. And then I got incredibly bored with the maintenance. I was like, okay, now I'm interested in growth. I'm interested in developing the team. I'm interested in identifying, what could be bigger, better, faster, stronger, and continue to build. So oftentimes I would end up replacing myself as the maintenance individual in those types of roles or those companies. And then over time, started finding more of the language around, my true avatar, that I work with, and for my company was those more growth minded, visionary type owners, like the more entrepreneurial type individuals
Sure.
that wanted to always explore and continue to grow. And it not necessarily needs to be like, okay, we're always growing top line revenue, or it's always like money based. Sometimes it can be, no, I'd love to continue exploring other service lines. How can we add more value, back to this particular niche that we serve, and just evolving and creating and building over time. And so that's where I think I again kind of naturally evolved to having to ask more questions and better questions at the very beginning to suss that out and figure out, were they more entrepreneurially minded, or would they rather just have something and kind of set it and forget it? And if that's the case, again, I know exactly who to place with them. I know, who's the right fit. But if they're more entrepreneurial minded and they want to grow and they have a different type of vision, then great. Tell me all of your dreams and aspirations and your big picture here, because then again it will help develop what that plan is, to actually execute upon, and I mean are not going to do it all overnight. I will be just totally transparent for any agency owner that's listening to this. It is not an overnight sensation for any agency, but it does give you the direction that you can point to for your team, for yourself, and then systematically chip away at the infrastructure that needs to be built, and shored up, so that you can continue that growth. And then it's a constant building process, just one brick
Yeah.
after the other, after that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I approach it.
Yeah. You seem very in tune with your authority X factor, Leah. You seem to know very well who you serve, how you help them, how your experience has led you to, the expertise that you have. In my book I talk about day one you. So day one you being, maybe that the version of you before you started Alderaan or in those early days. If you could go back and talk to yourself in those early days, that day one you, what advice would you give yourself now?
Oh, I love that question because uh, I appreciate, also the feedback that, I have that confidence in the authority X factor today because I have so many years that I can now reflect back on it and see the storyline, see, the points, along that journey and then connect those dots. And I think very, very early on, I would probably have given myself, the advice, to be honestly more of a critical thinker, and to take more time for this type of reflection back then, because there were a lot of opportunities very early on that I either could have capitalized on more, I could have improved on, or even been more aggressive with myself, for myself as an individual, was more reflective, and actually took the time to consider how my journey, even the interest that I had in journalism and other activities, for example, in high school or even younger, how that was already driving toward this authority X factor in my early years. And so it's taken me a longer amount of time, to again articulate it, to be able to verbalize and say, this is exactly who I know I'm a great fit for, and who my team is a great fit for, and why. Whereas early on, I was just doing it by instinct and it came very naturally, which good and bad.
Yeah.
In the moment, like good, because I was following it naturally and letting it play out. But then on the bad side, I think there were areas that I could have learned faster, learned earlier. I could have honestly just asked better questions, and really gained more perspective and insight from some of the business owners that I was working very closely with, and learned from, sometimes they would have decades of experience that I never really tapped into because I was really curious about the infrastructure I was building and how it would support them, but not necessarily about how they got there in the first place,
Yeah.
and maybe why they didn't have infrastructure. I just saw the gap and started filling it rather than asking, again, kind of more of those really deep dive, reflective or introspective questions. So I would say if I went back to that individual, back in the day, is to take more of that reflection time, and really think more critically.
Love that. Well, Leah, where can viewers and listeners find you online and learn more about Alderaan and Leah and what you do and how you might be able to help them?
Yeah, well, I'd say the main place to find me, honestly, is on LinkedIn. If you just do a search for Leah Leaves, I'm the only one out there. So you'll pretty much find me fast, or agency operations. You can search, and typically find me. I'm on LinkedIn, all the time, and love interacting and having real conversations, with people there. We also have our website, alderaanenterprise.com, and a newsletter that I send out every couple of weeks, just chit chatting about, agency operations and the biggest, areas for improvement for agencies. So LinkedIn and the website are main areas to find me.
Well, Leah, thank you so much. Thanks for coming on and sharing your authority X factor with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And then I'm really just excited to see, where your podcast goes and how we can all get our hands on your book, because I think this is exactly the type of reflection and introspective thinking that I think everyone can benefit from.
Thank you. Thanks, Leah. Thanks for watching. My book, Unlocking Your Authority X Factor, is now available on Amazon. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. See you next week.